Before starting the story, let us know where you're watching from and what time you're watching. The Children Who Never Blink. Chapter 1. The Arrival. When Emily Harper accepted the teaching position in the quaint village of Waverly, she thought she was finally leaving behind the chaos of her life in the city. The village's rolling hills, cobblestone streets, and serene countryside promised a fresh start, a place to heal and rebuild. Her first impression of Waverly was like stepping into a forgotten time with its old-fashioned lampposts, ivy-clad cottages, and townsfolk who seemed wary of outsiders but polite enough to greet her with nods and tight smiles. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of the village, nestled between a dense forest and a crystal-clear creek. It was a charming building with whitewashed walls and flower boxes brimming with marigolds. But something about it felt off. The windows, Emily noticed, always seemed too dark, as though they absorbed light rather than let it in. She dismissed the thought as nerves. Her students, a small group of about 20 children, were all impeccably behaved, polite to a fault, and unnervingly quiet. On her first day, Emily found herself both relieved and unsettled. She had expected the usual chatter and chaos of a classroom, but instead, the children sat straight backed in their wooden desks, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. It wasn't until the second week that she noticed the peculiar thing about them: they never blinked, not once. Chapter 2. Eunice. At first, Emily thought it was her imagination. She had been under a lot of stress lately, after all. But as the days turned into weeks, she couldn't ignore it. During lessons, their unblinking stares would bore into her, making her feel as though they could see straight into her thought. During recess, they would play silently, their expressions eerily blank, their wide eyes never closing, not even when the sun was high and bright. One evening, as she marked papers in her small rented cottage, she decided to confide in Martha, the elderly woman who owned the place. Martha had lived in Waverly her whole life and seemed to know everyone. "Martha, have you ever noticed anything strange about the children here?" Emily asked, trying to sound casual. Martha's hand froze mid-stitch in her knitting. She didn't look up, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the needles. "What do you mean by strange?" she asked, her voice careful. Emily hesitated. "It's probably nothing, but they don't seem to blink. Ever." Martha's eyes darted toward the window, as if expecting to see someone watching. "You're imagining things, dear," she said quickly. "Children are just peculiar sometimes." Her dismissive tone only deepened Emily's unease. She decided not to press further, but that night she found it difficult to sleep. She kept thinking about the way Martha had avoided her gaze, the way her voice had trembled ever so slightly. Something wasn't right in Waverly. Chapter 3. The Forest. The following week, Emily decided to take her class on a nature walk through the forest. She hoped the fresh air and change of scenery might help her connect with the children, who remained distant and unnervingly silent, despite her best efforts to engage them. The forest was beautiful, with towering oaks and a carpet of wildflowers, but as they ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt colder, the light dimmer, as though the forest itself was trying to swallow them whole. The children, however, seemed unfazed. They walked in perfect unison, their small feet crunching on the fallen leaves, their unblinking eyes scanning the surroundings with an almost predatory sharpness. Emily tried to strike up a conversation with a boy named Thomas, who seemed slightly more approachable than the others. "Do you like the forest, Thomas?" she asked, forcing a smile. He turned his head to look at her, his expression blank. "It's where we go to listen," he said simply. Emily frowned. "Listen to what?" But Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze forward, his small hand tightening around the strap of his backpack. The other children seemed to stiffen, as if they'd heard something she hadn't. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Emily's heart began to race. "All right, everyone," she said, forcing cheer into her voice. "Let's head back." As they walked back to the village, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Chapter 4. The Legend. That night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what Thomas had said. Frustrated and unable to sleep, she decided to do some digging. She remembered seeing an old book about Waverley's history in the cottage's small library. The book was thick and dusty, its pages yellowed with age. As she flipped through it, one chapter caught her eye, The Curse of Waverley's Children. Her blood ran cold as she read the words. According to the legend, over a century ago, a reclusive woman named Eliza Grayson lived on the outskirts of the village. She was rumored to be a witch, though no one dared to confront her. One year, a terrible illness swept through Waverley, claiming the lives of dozens of children. Desperate for someone to blame, the villagers turned on Eliza, accusing her of cursing their children. They dragged her from her home and burned her at the stake. With her dying breath, Eliza cursed the village, vowing that its children would serve as a reminder of their cruelty. They will see everything she had screamed, they will never blink, and they will never forget. Emily's hands trembled as she closed the book. It was just a story, she told herself. A dark, terrible story. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Chapter 5. The Revelation. The next morning, Emily arrived at the schoolhouse to find the children already inside, seated at their desks. They turned their heads in unison to look at her as she entered, their wide, unblinking eyes sending a shiver down her spine. "Good morning," she said, her voice shaking slightly. They didn't respond, only continued to stare. She tried to carry on with the lesson, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "Why don't you blink?" she blurted out, her voice louder than she'd intended. The children exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Then Thomas stood up, his small face pale but resolute. "We can't," he said. "If we do, they'll come." Emily's heart pounded. "Who will come?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the window and pointed toward the forest. "They watch us from the trees. They're always watching." Chapter 6. The Truth. That evening, Emily decided to confront Martha again. This time, she wasn't leaving without answers. "Martha," she said, her voice trembling, "I know something's wrong with the children. I read about the curse. Please tell me the truth." Martha sighed heavily and set down her knitting. "You should have left when you had the chance," she said. "The curse is real. The children, they're bound to it. If they blink, they'll see the ones who took Eliza. And those spirits, they'll take the children too." Emily's blood turned to ice. "Is there a way to stop it?" Martha shook her head. "It's been this way for generations. The only way to break the curse is to confront what lies in the forest. But no one who's tried has ever returned." Chapter 7. The Confrontation. Determined to free the children, Emily ventured into the forest that night, armed with a flashlight and nothing else. The trees loomed like shadowy giants, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The deeper she went, the colder it became, until her breath puffed in the air like smoke. She heard whispers, soft, guttural voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. A flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into darkness. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to keep going. She stumbled into a clearing where an ancient, gnarled tree stood at the center. Its trunk was blackened, its roots twisted like tortured limbs. "Who dares disturb us?" a voice hissed. Shadows began to coalesce around the tree, forming grotesque humanoid shapes. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their mouths twisted into cruel, jagged smiles. "I'm here to end this," Emily said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Let the children go." The shadows laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. "The children are ours," they said. "Their fear sustains us. Their unblinking eyes keep us alive." Desperate, Emily remembered the book. Eliza's curse had been born from the villagers' cruelty. Maybe it could be undone by compassion? "Eliza," she called out, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what they did to you. They were wrong. But the children don't deserve this. Please let them go." For a moment there was silence. Then the shadows began to writhe, their forms distorting. A soft, mournful voice echoed through the clearing. "They will be free," it said, "but the price must be paid." Emily felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned to see a spectral figure, a woman with hollow eyes and a face etched with sorrow. "You must stay in their place," the woman said. "Only then will they be free." Chapter 8. The Sacrifice. Emily's heart ached, but she knew what she had to do. "I'll stay," she whispered. The shadows retreated, their laughter fading into the night. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, Emily felt herself becoming part of the forest, her body dissolving into the air. She was no longer afraid. The children woke that morning with tears in their eyes, blinking for the first time in their lives. They remembered everything, the fear, the darkness, but they also remembered the sacrifice of the woman who had saved them. Waverly's curse was broken, but in the forest, if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers of a teacher who gave everything for her students.